Hello everyone. So today we are going to go over lab assignment 3 material of our anatomy course. So the order of what we're going to go over today is basically I'm going to introduce the skull bones, then I'm going to go over the bones of the orbit, and then I'm going to go over the brain, the lobes, and the specific parts that we went over in our lab assignment, and then also the meninges. And then I'm going to go over the dural folds and the venous drainage, which are the sinuses. And then finally, I'm going to go over the circle of Willis, and then cover a clinical case. All right, so now I'm going to go over the anterior view of the bone, the skull. And so we have here the anterior view of the skull. You can see that I drew right here. And so we'll just go from top to bottom basically. So as you can see here at the top over here, right, that makes the front part of the skull is the frontal bone. Frontal bone is a very big, large bone, so it's easily identifiable, and it sits right on top of the orbit right here. Then we have these two bones right here, which make up the nasal bone. Sit on top of the nasal cavity right here. And then if we go down, we have the sphenoid bone. Now the sphenoid bone makes up sort of the posterior part of the orbit, and also sits right next to another bone that we know as temporal bone, which we'll go over in the lateral view. So it's basically these two portions of the bone, but it's one continuous bone. Then if we go down, we have the maxilla. Now the maxilla is just this, you can think of it as this middle portion of the skull, right above sort of this bottom portion, which we'll go over very shortly in a sec. Now we have the vomer bone, which is this bottom portion of our nose. And then, like we had just discussed, we have our jaw, which is made up by the bone called the mandible. Then if we work our way up, we have what's known as the inferior nasal concha. Now the inferior nasal concha is the bottom portion of the inner portion of the nasal cavity. And then we have what's known as the zygomatic bone, and it's on both sides, of course. But you can see right here, this part right here that ends up here and right below the orbit, but makes up the orbit, as we will go over soon. And then finally, we have the palatine bone, which is a very tiny bone, but it's just right sort of on the lower corner there of the orbit. Alright, and so that's the overview of the anterior view of the skull. Okay, so now we went over the anterior view, and now we will go over the lateral view of the skull. Okay, so here's the lateral view, overview of the skull. So, like we talked about before, we have the frontal bone. And if we go down here to the orbit, we have two bones called the lacrimal bone, which is this bigger portion of the bone right here, and we have an ethmoid bone, which is a smaller bone, but it's down here in this photo. And then if we go to the lobes, these should be fairly simple if you know your lobes, but we'll go over the lobes fairly shortly. We'll go over the lobes. This is the temporal bone. This is the parietal bone, and then finally on the back of the head, the posterior part of the head of the skull is the occipital bone. Okay, so now we are going to go over the bones of the orbit, and then share a mnemonic that will help remember these bones. So there are 7 bones of the orbit that we will go over today. In this image that I drew here and color-coded for you, there are only 6 bones shown. We will go over the 7th bone very shortly. So let's go from the larger bones to the smaller bones. So we have first, again, like we went over before, the frontal bone up here on the top of the orbit. So it makes up the top portion of the orbit right here. We have the zygomatic bone right here and right here. And it makes up the sort of the side portion opposite of the nasal side of the orbit. Then we have the sphenoid bone, which makes up the posterior part of the orbit. Then we have the maxilla right here that makes up the bottom portion of the orbit. And then the smaller bones down here are the lacrimal bone here in purple on both sides, and then the ethmoid bone in here in green. And the palatine bone is not shown here, but it would be sort of down on the corner of the orbit, the nasal corner of the orbit on both sides, of course. So right here you can see that I wrote out a mnemonic in this organizational scheme for you here. So we have the 7 bone names, and basically I wrote them in order from sort of larger bones to smaller bones, to the smaller bones. And so it's just a very silly mnemonic, but hopefully it will help you guys remember. So the bone names are frontal, zygomatic, maxilla, sphenoid, ethmoid, palatine, and lacrimal. And the mnemonic is fussy, zesty Muppets, scared, exotic, Popeye, lamely. I hope that helps. Alright, so now we will go over the brain and the meninges. So we'll start with the meninges here. The meninges, I have them drawn right here, are basically 3 protective layers that surround the brain and the spinal cord. So up here we have the skull, and then we have the dura mater, which is the first protective layer of the meninges, and that's that brown colored layer that I drew for you right there. Then we have the arachnoid mater, which is this layer right here, this white layer. And right below the arachnoid mater, attached to it, is basically the subarachnoid space. And you have these sort of web-like structures, hence the name arachnoid. And then finally we have the pia mater, which sits right on top of the brain. Now, in terms of its relationship to the lecture content, we can bring up the image back here. And so we have first the dura mater, which is, the dura mater is the outermost, toughest layer of the meninges. And then we have the arachnoid mater. Now the arachnoid mater is the middle layer, like we talked about, that white layer right here. And it has a web-like texture, and the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater right here, with these webs, quote unquote, contains cerebrospinal fluid. And this sort of helps the brain sort of jostle when it's jostling around, not get injured. And then finally we have the pia mater, which is the innermost meninge layer, and it's directly adhered to the surface of the brain. So now we're going to go over the brain and its respective parts. So I'll start off with a drawing again of mine. And so this drawing is color-coded, coloring the lobes here. So we have first in blue the frontal lobe, and then in a pinkish purple we have the parietal lobe, and then we have the temporal lobe right here in orange, and then finally the occipital lobe. And then we have the cerebellum down here, and over here, not labeled yet, but this is the brainstem, and we'll see it on a sagittal view shortly. And then to expand the cerebellum down here, we have the 2 hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere, and then in the middle we have the vermis. So here we have the sagittal view of the brain, drawing that I drew here. And so let's go over it. So we have first the cerebral cortex, which is this entire part right here, this entire length of the brain. Then we have the thalamus, which is this middle portion right here, which makes up part of the diencephalon. Then right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, that space down there. And then right below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which is that little bubble you can see down there connected to it. Then below that entire complex right here of the thalamus, hypothalamus, we have the midbrain down here. And then below the midbrain, we have this bulge down here, which is the pons. And then finally, we end with the medulla oblongata right here, which then eventually leads to the spinal cord. And finally, two of our terms are called ventricles. We have the lateral ventricle right here, and we have the fourth ventricle down here, this sort of triangle space area right here between the cerebellum and the pons and medulla oblongata. And basically, these ventricles contain the fluid known as the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, and these ventricles are basically open chambers that contain this CSF, and where it's also produced and where it circulates. And so these are the two terms that we need to know just about the ventricles. There are more ventricles, of course, but they are not covered in our week's material. Now that we went over the anatomy of the brain, we are going to go over its relationship to the lecture content. So we'll start off with the image that I drew in the beginning, that I showed in the beginning, of the lobes. And so let's first address that these dark lines that make up the brain in this image here are basically representing valleys, or sulci, as their term is called. And there are shallow grooves that are separating what are known as gyri, which are these elevated ridges. And I know you can't really tell that very well here, but you can sort of imagine that, you know, after seeing so many of these images of the brain, you can see that these gyri sort of form these ridges, and that obviously increases the surface area of the brain. So then we have the longitudinal fissure, which is not drawn here, but you can imagine it sort of separates this hemisphere from the other hemisphere of the brain. Then we have the cerebral cortex. And now the cerebral cortex is basically the outer layer that is responsible for multiple things such as conscious thought, problem solving, personality, dreams, and language. Alright, down here you can see we have the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is basically the second largest part of the brain. It also has two hemispheres, the left and the right, and it's separated by the vermis. And the function of the cerebellum is that it fine-tunes motor control for smooth coordinated movements and the maintenance of posture. Alright, we're back here with the sagittal view of the brain and its relationship to the lecture content. So we have the diencephalon that we talked about before, which is made up by the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And so the thalamus is important because it processes all the sensory input. The hypothalamus is important because it has control of the autonomic nervous system. And it helps to regulate very important things such as temperature, your hunger, your thirst, the circadian rhythm that allows you to sleep at night, the heart rate, and finally the blood pressure. And it also initiates your physical response to emotions such as fear and anger. Then finally we have the pituitary gland, and that's basically an endocrine gland, which endocrine gland secretes hormones, and it's also connected to the diencephalon via the infundibulum. The brainstem is important because it processes information going to and from the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, and the cerebellum. The midbrain processes sight, sound, and it triggers reflexes related to these senses. The pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. The medulla oblongata connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it regulates autonomic functions such as the heart rate, the blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. Now we are going to go over the dural folds and the venous drainage, or the venous sinuses of the brain. And so I have a drawing again here for you guys. And this is the lateral, you can think of it as the lateral posterior side of the head. It's a slice horizontally and sort of vertically, and that chunk of the head of the skull has been taken out so you can see inside. And so we will start first with the dural folds, since all of our week's dural folds are shown on this image. So first we have the falx cerebri, which is right here, this white sort of shaded space here. Then we have the tentorium cerebelli, which is down right here, and then attached to that is the falx cerebelli right there. Alright, now we are going to go over the venous sinuses. First we have the superior sagittal sinus, which is encompassed by this whole thing right here. Then that leads into the confluence of sinuses right here, that meeting point. And we have the sigmoid sinus, kind of looks like an S down here. Here is a transverse slice of the head, and this is the superior view, basically top down. And we have the continuation of the venous sinuses. So we have the confluence of sinuses, like we talked about, leading into the transverse sinus, and then over here we have the two sets of cavernous sinuses. So now we will talk about the dural folds and their relationship to the lecture content. So I'll bring up that image again here. So we have first the falx cerebri. Now the falx cerebri is right here, and you can imagine that that's basically, that's important because it divides the cerebral hemispheres. And the dural folds are essentially double folds of dura mater, and they project into the fissures of the brain. And so in falx cerebri's case, it's the longitudinal fissure that we talked about earlier. And they separate different parts of the brain from each other, simply. Okay, and then we have the tentorium cerebelli, and that divides the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So it's like this sort of flat surface down here. And then we have the falx cerebelli, and that simply divides the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the venous sinuses and their relationship to the lecture content. So I'll bring up the image again. So we have the superior sagittal sinus. The superior sagittal sinus. That is this top part right here, and that takes the venous blood and it meets into the confluence of sinuses, that junction down here. And this portion right here is the transverse sinus, which we can see on the other image, which I'll bring up shortly. But the transverse sinus then floods into the sigmoid sinus right here, that S-shaped sinus, and that floods eventually into the internal jugular vein and goes out of the brain. And the interesting thing about the dural venous sinuses is that they do not have valves, unlike most veins of the body. Here's a superior view image again, and we can see the confluence of sinuses, which drains into the transverse sinus, and then eventually the sigmoid sinus, and then the internal jugular vein. And then the cavernous sinuses, the pair right here, they are important because they drain the ophthalmic veins. So now we are going to move on to the structure known as the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is basically the blood supply to the brain. It's a collection of the arteries that provide blood to the brain. So again, we'll start off with a drawing that I have here. And so first we have the anterior cerebral artery, and there are two sets of them on the top, the anterior cerebral artery. And then we have, once we go down, we have these two jutting inwards are the internal carotid arteries, and then right next to them jutting outwards are the middle cerebral arteries. And then as we go down the circle, we have the posterior cerebral arteries on either side right here. And then we have the basilar artery right here. And finally we have the vertebral artery. So basically the flow is from the vertebral artery all the way up the circle. Alright, I have a mnemonic for the circle of Willis structures right here. So we'll start with the we'll go in the order of the blood flow, starting with the vertebral artery. And so it's vegetarians bake pumpkins in cans most always. And so that's V for vertebral vegetarians, bake, base layer, pumpkins, posterior, cerebral, in cans, internal carotid, in cans, most, middle, cerebral, and always, anterior cerebral. So it's vegetarians bake pumpkins in cans most always. So now that we are finished with the anatomy and its relationship to the lecture content, we will go over a clinical case that I've chosen for us today. And the clinical case is skull fractures. So a skull fracture is basically any break in the cranial bone, and there are many types of skull fractures, but we won't go over all of them today. The main cause of skull fractures is an impact or a blow to the head that's strong enough to break the bone. And so an injury to the brain can also accompany a fracture, but that's not always the case. And so fracture isn't always easy to see. But however, there are some symptoms that can indicate that fracture is there. And those symptoms are swelling and tenderness around the area of impact. We have facial bruising, and we have bleeding from the nostrils and from the ears. There are also different types of skull fractures, like I just said. So the one we'll talk about today is a basal fracture. Basal skull fractures occur in the floor of the skull. These are the areas around the eyes, the ears, the nose, or at the top of the neck and near the spine. Specifically, the basal skull fractures are caused by blunt force trauma. That's trauma to the head, traumatic head injury. The bones that are affected are basically the temporal bone, you have the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, and the occipital bone. Now, basal skull fractures are more common in young adults, as some studies show. Now, also most skull fractures aren't too painful. The skull will heal itself in the majority of these cases. In basal skull fractures, the treatment is generally medication to manage the pain, and that may be all that's needed. But there are some rare cases where surgery may be needed, and that's, in this case, in the basal skull fracture, is when you may have a rare case of an excessive leakage of the cerebral spinal fluid, either through the nose or through the ears, like we had said. Now, cerebral spinal fluid leak repair is performed endoscopically, and it's performed from the sinus side. So the surgeon will get graft material and place it over the CSF, or the cerebral spinal fluid leak site in the skull base, and then sometimes it's secured with a surgical adhesive as well. Overall, skull fractures, like the basal skull fractures, are preventable, and simply by wearing a protective gear such as a helmet when you're riding a bike, or when you're participating in excessive sports, rigorous sports such as football, rock climbing, or hockey, it's all preventable if you just wear a helmet. Thank you.